Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Thursday, May 27th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun. Catherine was wandering near the turret towers after summer one evening, as she had gotten into a habit of watching for messengers, knowing now that King Charles' surrender was likely near. Suddenly she saw movement and realized that Carinza was standing there, near one of the doors that led to a stone parapet looking out to the sea. After that, there was a sheer drop to the ground. "Carinza!" "Don't worry," Carinza said wryly. "I wasn't planning to throw myself on the rocks." "Do not even say such a thing. You do look somewhat unwell, however," Catherine replied. "I suppose everyone has guessed by now," Carinza said dejectedly. "Harold Montgomery?" "Yes," Carinza answered. "It's over. I should have known better than to get my hopes up. It's just that he seemed so sincere, that he honestly cared for me. Did it not seem that way to you?" "It did," Catherine replied truthfully. "I hate her," Carinza said, and there was no reason to be specific about to whom she was referring. Catherine realized that Carinza would hate Lizette not only for stealing her bow, but also for finding him not good enough, as it had circulated through the neighborhood that Lizette had now rejected Harold. "It's as if, after taking him from me, her work was done and she simply moved on. Perhaps it is just as well," Carinza continued. "If he is that easily let off, then he probably would not have been a very devoted husband." She smiled weakly at Catherine. "I guess it is difficult for you to understand, having been married to Robert and now every man in Cornwall seeking your hand. Of course you're so attractive and I'm so plain. You always did talk a lot of nonsense about that. You should have seen them trying to curl my hair for balls, as if anyone ever would have asked me to dance. Half an hour later my hair was as straight as ever, as if I had never endured the agony of it all. Those curl papers were a sign. You read too much into everything. It's no sign except that certain hair is difficult to curl. I can speak from experience, my friend." Catherine laughed in an attempt to bring a light note to the conversation. "I remember when I first met Sarah, coveting her natural curls, but then she instantly regretted bringing up her name. It doesn't matter," she went on quickly, "because beauty does not come from curl papers, anyway, but rather from what's inside." "You sound like a priest," Carinza said. "It's practical advice you should take to heart," Catherine replied. "Well, maybe, although I still think men are scared off because they know I'm a poor relation." "Yes, because you scare them off. It is something they would not even think of if you did not continuously point it out." "You're so patient and understanding," Carinza said at length, "and I sound like someone who has nothing better to do than whine." "Not at all. But on another subject, what is this animosity between you and Sarah about? I have to admit I heard you quarreling one time, and I believe there is more to it than either of you let on." Catherine knew that there was a certain jealousy there, but believed it was more complicated than that. "She puts on airs. I dislike her. I think she is a gossip, and now brazen of her to get herself pregnant and expect you to fix everything for her." "It was an unscrupulous fellow who got her pregnant, Carrie, and I didn't fix anything for her. Edward had long wanted to marry her and merely used this as his excuse. Now what is the source of this bitter feud between you two?" When she questioned her further, however, Carinza closed her lips tightly and refused to say more. Catherine expressed her concern to Julian, but he had merely shrugged. "It has always been so," Julian said. "They got on poorly from the beginning. Of course, Carrie can be a bit difficult, but Sarah does seem to take a high-handed attitude that puts some people off. She tends to meddle, and as well, enjoys a good gossip. Maybe this offends Carinza for some reason, but I've never been able to come up with a convincing reason for so much rancor between them. Even when people take little offenses at this or at that, it does not usually cause that big of a rift. They tolerate each other for the most part, though." Catherine realized there was little she could do to help unless the two would be a bit more honest about the reason for the conflict. She went to find her younger brother and sister and decided to put the matter from her mind. Julian certainly did not think about it beyond this short conversation with Catherine, as he was far more interested in speaking to Ernest again, who was waiting in his study. "As I've said to Christopher," Julian said, "I am asking from a point of desperation. Have you noticed anything unusual about anyone, including people we might consider friends?" Not specifically, but now with this fire, I may be able to forge a bit of a trail as it narrows down the number of people who could be responsible. I'm afraid I'm quite lost, Julian said. Are you suggesting that there is some correlation between the fire and the other events? The fire was the one thing I convinced myself was merely an accident. However, you believe it was not. I can see it in your expression. No, I believe all the strange happenings have the same source, Ernest replied, from Robert's death to the false message received by Catherine, the shooting, and now with the fire. But the fire was started in her bedroom, meaning it would have to be someone in the home who purposely lit it, Julian replied incredulously. Well, you were having a party, and it is a large household, sir, Ernest said quietly. It may have also been someone in the home who had the message sent or claimed it was sent from Catherine's aunt. But if the purpose of the message was to lure her to France, surely the culprit would have wanted to meet her at the other end. No one has gone to France and come back without me noticing. My point is escaping you, Ernest replied. I am thinking that perhaps it was not so much they wanted to lure her to France, rather that they wanted to lure her away from this household. They heard her speak of an aunt in France and created a fake message to get her to leave. Julian dismissed the idea at once, but the only person who had any grievance against her was my unfortunate self, and I certainly did not create fake messages to send her away, he exclaimed in frustration. Besides, she would know it was false as soon as she arrived. What of that? Yes, but that would not have necessarily made her return, because her aunt would surely have welcomed her despite the mystery surrounding why she came. It was, after all, where she intended to go anyway. She would hardly turn around and come back to Briarwood just to see what the mischief was concerning the message. With this, Julian had to agree. And as I said before, Ernest went on, it's a large household, and Sarah did say that the messenger was not the usual one, and you have stated that Janet told you she could not remember having seen him before. Therefore, he could have been anybody put up to the task by virtually anyone. If he was paid well enough, the man would do his job and keep quiet. But ultimately, it was Reginald or Catherine's father who killed Robert, Julian said with a conviction he didn't feel. I can't see that those incidents are related. All I can say is that as an investigator, I've spent my life tying together incidents in order to make sense of strange happenings, and I believe it is the same person or group of people at the heart of all these things. I'm also not convinced that Reginald or Catherine's father was responsible for Robert's death. In his heart, Julian was not sure either, as neither man seemed a likely suspect, since they both had alibis, although weak. He also remembered Catherine's insistence on several occasions that someone was inside the house. He thought that perhaps he had spent so much time convincing her it could not be her father that he spent no time looking at anyone else. It was true she had this obsession regarding Blake, but she was certainly not hallucinating these episodes, and at any rate, numerous witnesses were present at the fire and the shooting. Finally, he looked at Ernest helplessly. But it is an utterly ridiculous notion that a member of my household would have killed Robert or be trying to kill Catherine. She is loved by everyone. Robert was too. There was at least one who did not love him, sir, Ernest replied, and his remark was met with profound silence. I can only speak from a lifetime of such work, and I can tell you of a certainty that such things are not always obvious. I've investigated marriages that were supposedly idyllic, where both parties were involved with others. I've investigated men who claimed to be heirs to great fortunes and firmly established, only to discover it was fabricated so they could marry into wealthy families. Some carry it off beautifully, and would never know it is all a farce. I've also seen women like Catherine who are loved by all, as you say, yet someone somewhere is harboring ill will, although it is never where it can be seen on the surface. And how does one ever determine the guilty party in such cases? Julian demanded. The person must be caught in the act, Ernest replied. Later that day, when he was riding alone, Julian thought of Catherine, hearing the detective's words over and over in his mind. Such things did happen, after all. People plotting against others, families torn apart with desire or greed or hatred. Somewhere in the world there is always someone wanting to rid himself or herself of someone else. He attempted to check his soaring imagination, but it was pointless to argue that danger was not stalking Catherine. And yet, as he turned over in his mind every person who either lived in the house or had access to it, he could see no motive for these attempts on her life. One could argue that Lizette had reason to want her out of the way, but murder? His mind continued at a fevered pace. What was the connection between Robert and Catherine other than the marriage? Why isn't the guilty party interested in me? Could it have been some enemy from years gone by, or an old lover obsessed with one of them? He knew most of the women in Robert's past, and there were certainly none who seemed outright mad or vengeful enough to commit murder. Catherine herself had definitely had no man before Robert, unless there was one she had spurned and it turned his head to the point of murderous vengeance. It is all too fantastic, he thought. Such situations rarely drive people to murder. But it made no sense either that someone in his own household had something against either his brother, Catherine, or both. It was easy to eliminate certain people, such as Richard and Jennifer, Carinza, Paul, even Edward, in spite of who his father was, since Catherine had done so much to help Sarah and facilitate the marriage. Sarah herself briefly came to mind, but she seemed to have special feelings for her new mistress, and even she were resentful underneath. Could that hostility be strong enough to turn her into a murderess? She seemed far more likely to murder Carinza, he thought, giving into dark humor. And what of Robert's death? Sarah would not suddenly develop a resentment against him after practically being raised with him and fancying herself related. And if she were, why would it only be Robert and not himself as well? Besides, he thought, even if they were displeased with their status or carried away with silly fantasies, servants did not typically murder those responsible for paying their salaries and keeping them in secure positions. Others randomly flitted through his consciousness. Suddenly he thought again of Carinza, and was ashamed of such a treacherous thought. Lord, don't let me go mad myself trying to figure this out. Carinza has some resentments, that's true. She is not a murderess. Did Robert perhaps stumble upon something in the woods he was not meant to see, and was murdered in order to quiet him? But why was he there to begin with, alone at dusk? Perhaps it was possible that Catherine and Robert had been targeted by completely different people for completely different reasons. No, lightning does not strike twice in one household. Finally, he spurred his horse in frustration and rode back to the manor, no closer to any answers than he was an hour before. As always, when Catherine was worried about herself, she attempted to find ways to take her mind off her problems, which was usually to help others. She went to check on Sarah and Edward and saw that it was a genuinely happy marriage, or else it was a great deal of acting on both Edward and Sarah's part, which she really didn't believe. Edward was clearly in love, and when no one was around but Catherine or some other trusted soul, he always referred to Sarah's pregnancy as the poor girl being taken advantage of. And Catherine had the distinct feeling that he fancied himself a hero who saved the day. Well, she thought, there's nothing unhealthy about that. Shouldn't your husband be your hero in one way or another? Realizing suddenly that it was almost supper hour, Catherine asked Sarah to help her change, as Rose was indisposed with a slight stomach malady. As the two ascended the stairs, Sarah looked at Catherine with a troubled expression and said, "Has there been any new information about anything, or am I crossing the lines of etiquette to ask?" "No, you are not," Catherine replied, sighing heavily. "And what you are asking has anyone come to the conclusions about who might mean me harm?" "Well, I wasn't going to put it that way," Sarah said quickly, "but I suppose you are far too intelligent not to know that most of the household is feeling the consternation. I wonder sometimes if Lizette's words on that long-ago day were true, about me bringing bad luck to this home. But then again, the bad luck seems aimed in my direction," Catherine said ruefully. "It is a great mystery," Sarah replied. "The more I ask of the servants, the less information I can find. It's as if these things are going on right under all our noses, and yet no one ever hears anything, sees anything, or witnesses anything. It can make one feel as if he or she is going mad. Somebody at some point had to have heard or seen something. Sarah, sometimes I feel I'm risking my life to remain here, and if I don't take Robert and flee, I won't have any future to worry about. You obviously know these things are not just fancies on my part, which is what I think everyone believed until some of the more obvious episodes. Every time I go out, I feel I should look over my shoulder in case somebody is there to do me harm. But you did not fare well when you left last time, my lady, albeit for different reasons," Sarah pointed out. "That's true. I would have to plan far more carefully this time. Yet when I think of leaving, it's almost as if I can feel my heart breaking." Suddenly realizing she had said far too much, Catherine stopped abruptly and began talking about the gown she wanted to change into for supper, and whether or not they would get rain in the next morning as Edward had predicted. "Well, he certainly has a knack for smelling rain in the air," Sarah said, quickly picking up on Catherine's preference to change the subject. Later, Catherine laughed at herself in the mirror. "As if I could ever leave Julian. A few moments later, her emotions in check, she descended the stairs for supper. Carissa had pleaded a headache that night and had not joined them, and Catherine believed she was embarrassed, as everyone knew by then that the romance with Harold was over. She wanted to help her, but Carissa consistently affirmed she was over him and felt fine. Catherine, however, was not convinced. One day she found Julian in the stables where one of the grooms was saddling his horse. He looked handsome and elegant as always, and she stopped for just a moment to watch him before he saw her. "Julian, may I ride with you?" He turned and asked, with a twinkle in his eye, if she thought there were any possibility he would say no, and then told the groom to bring her mare without delay. Is there something specific you wanted to say to me?" he asked as they were headed across the field. "I'm concerned about Carrie," she replied. "It's over with Montgomery, then?" Julian said. "I'm not surprised after seeing Lizette at work to ruin the affair." He sighed, shaking his head because he knew Lizette was attempting to make him jealous, which was utterly futile. When he left without making any declaration, I assumed he had changed his mind, yet I hoped otherwise. She did say that perhaps it is for the best if he was so easily amused by another, although I'm not sure if she really meant it or was putting up a brave front, replied Catherine. "'Tis a good point, whether she fully meant it or not. If he truly loved Carrie, he would not have been that quickly enamored of another woman. Lizette has become such a spiteful and destructive person. I'm at the end of my patience with her games and the way she plays with other people's lives. I know you think I do the same, but not to that extent. That is merely cruel for the sake of being cruel. Is it not? She told me she was toying with the man, but I thought that if he really cared for Carissa, perhaps it wouldn't matter." "She actually told you? She's a nervy woman, I will give her that." "Not really," Julian replied. "She would not care for what I thought. She would regard me as a fellow sinner." Catherine smiled. "Perhaps, although I know you would never trample on another to get what you want. I've certainly never seen you lavish attention on a woman in whom you were not genuinely interested. But surely we must be able to do something for her," Catherine said at length. "Was she always so withdrawn and introverted?" "Yes, due to her inability to drop this poor relation nonsense. It does not put her at the grand disadvantage she seems to think, but she constantly reminds any prospective suitors that this is the case. Think of it, she infers I am only a poor relation. Are you sure you want to continue this courtship? And she says it in word or gesture so often that any potential beau becomes weary and thinks perhaps he's making a grave mistake when he'd have never noticed it except for her continuous reminders. I tried to tell her the exact thing. She creates a situation out of nothing. In truth, she is not unattractive. No, indeed she is not. Long ago I thought perhaps she would come out from behind the wall she's put up, and Robert and I did our best to charm away her resentment. However, when we grew older, I think she had her heart set on one of us for a husband, and perhaps it was a disappointment she never got over." "Was there talk of a match then?" Catherine asked, remembering what Jennifer had said. "Our father would not have objected to it, and I'm sure there was a bit of speculation, as there always is in such cases. Nevertheless, at that time marriage was the furthest thing from my mind, and Robert would never have married unless he was in love." "I confess it is difficult to imagine you married to anyone," Catherine said, smiling. "Kathy, you are so beautiful. Sometimes I look at you and I cannot stop. They must think me obsessed." "You are," she replied with an amused expression. "May I tell you what I like most about coming back from a ride? It is when we make the last turn toward the manor, when we are coming from the west and the towers come into view. The sun picks out sharp points in the granite, and they look like jewels of all kinds, diamonds and other gemstones. It is an outstanding sight that never fails to impress me. It is arrogant and bold, just like you. It always seems like a living thing to me. I never fail to feel proud to have any connection to it at all."